The original title of Charles Chesnutt's first collection of short stories, The Conjure Woman, is potentially misleading. While all of the stories in this collection do in one way or another involve magic spells, conjuring, the sources and the context of this conjuring vary. The Conjure Woman, Aunt Peggy, figures only in about half of the stories. I mention this because the inappropriate initial title prefigured and perhaps even contributed to what many scholars now consider incomplete initial readings, perhaps even misreadings, of Chesnutt's Uncle Julius stories. Chesnutt's Conjure Tales borrow several narrative conventions from Old Southwest humor. Old Southwest humor, the Old Southwest, including Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, that is, the current Southeast, flourished from the 1830s through the Civil War and had a major influence on the early career of Mark Twain. These humorous tales usually feature a backwoodsman who describes in colorful language and obvious exaggeration hunts, fights, contests set in such locales as backwoods cabins or riverboats, places outside the bounds of civilized society. Many of the works of Old Southwest humor use a narrative frame in which a literate, relatively refined narrator recounts a story heard from an eccentric local character. This structure emphasizes the oral nature of much of this literature. For realism's sake, we have someone who can write, purporting to transcribe the speech of someone who, in most instances, probably cannot. Much of the pleasure of reading these works comes from the use of the vernacular, the authors using I dialect to approximate on the page how the words sound. Thus, in Chesnutt's The Gopher Grapevine, for example, Uncle Julius says he lives des over yonder, for just over yonder, and asks the narrator John if he is the northern gentleman, who is going to buy the old vineyard, or going to buy the old vineyard. The introductory paragraphs of The Gopher Grapevine, the first Conjure story Chesnutt wrote, and the opening story in the Conjure Woman collection, established Chesnutt's narrative frame for all of his Uncle Julius stories. John, the frame narrator, is a man from Ohio who has moved to North Carolina for the sake of his wife Annie's health. This educated man encounters Uncle Julius McAdoo, an elderly former slave sitting on a log on a rundown plantation that John is considering purchasing. Julius tries to dissuade John from buying the land, claiming that the vines have been cursed, goofered. Like many stories in the Old Southwest humor tradition, Julius's tale involves a contest of wits, particularly as old Marse Dougal McAdoo, the stereotypically frugal Scot, plots to keep his slaves from eating his grapes by hiring Aunt Peggy to put a gopher on them. The tale takes a supernatural twist when, not having been informed about this curse, new slave Henry eats the gopher grapes. Henry subsequently thrives when the grapes grow in the spring and withers when the grapes die off in the winter. Discovering this pattern of metamorphosis, Dougal McAdoo profits from this situation by selling Henry in the spring when he is strong and buying him back at a much discounted rate when he is weak. For 5 years, Dougal McAdoo makes a handsome profit from selling Henry high and buying him back low until a wily Yankee, who wins a bundle from Dougal playing cards, tricks him into pruning his grapes so much that they die early, resulting in Henry's death. The frame narrator, John, is amused by this colorful tale, though he doesn't believe a word of it. In fact, John later believes he discovers Julius's actual motive for telling of the gopher grapes. Quote, I found when I bought the vineyard that Uncle Julius had occupied a cabin on the place for many years and derived a respectable revenue from the neglected grapevines. This doubtless accounted for his advice to me not to buy the vineyard, though whether it inspired the gopher story I am unable to state. I believe, however, that the wages I pay him for his services are more than an equivalent for anything he lost by the sale of the vineyard. In a retrospective essay he wrote in 1931, the year before his death, Chesnutt noted of his character Uncle Julius, quote, In every instance, Julius had an axe to grind. The wind-up of each story reveals the old man's ulterior purpose, which, as a general thing, is accomplished. Most contemporary reviews of The Conjure Woman, however, mentioned little about the narrative frame, focusing instead on the exotic nature of Uncle Julius's tales themselves. In fact, though the frame narrator John senses Julius's ulterior motive for telling each tale, his own attitude seems to reflect the racial superiority felt by many whites of the day. Thus, for example, at the outset of Poe Sandy, John remarks, quote, "Some of these stories are quaintly humorous, others wildly extravagant, revealing the oriental cast of the Negro's imagination." In a later portion of the Chesnutt 1880 journal entry from which I quoted in the Things to Consider Chesnutt video, Chesnutt acknowledged about his attack on white racism, quote, "The subtle, almost indefinable feeling of repulsion toward the Negro, which is common to most Americans, cannot be stormed and taken by assault. The garrison will not capitulate, so their position must be mined, that is, undermined, and we will find ourselves in their midst before they think it." By the late 1890s, Chesnutt perhaps had come to realize that he may have been too subtle for his audience in the Uncle Julius stories, that most readers of his day were not willing or perhaps capable of seeing beyond the smugness of his frame narrator. And as will be examined in the next section, perhaps the plantation genre itself, and especially the popular figure of Uncle Remus, worked too strongly against what Chesnutt was attempting to achieve.